Hey guys, tonight we begin with the brutal, back-breaking, and not-so-magnificent world of Great Wall construction workers, those nameless labourers who hauled stones up mountains and mixed mortar with their own blood to build China's most famous monument. While tourism brochures make it look majestic, the truth is being a Great Wall worker seriously sucked. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's be clear, no one in ancient China woke up and said, you know what, I'd like to haul 1,000-pound stones up a mountain for 14 hours a day and sleep in a freezing cave for the honour of maybe not starving to death. Becoming a Great Wall worker wasn't a career path. It was more like a last stop on the life went horribly wrong train. Most Great Wall labourers weren't ambitious stonemasons or patriotic volunteers. They were desperate peasants, convicted criminals, captured soldiers, or people so unlucky they got snatched up in the emperor's labour drafts and sent north with nothing but the clothes on their backs. If you were well off, you didn't become a wall builder. You paid someone to go in your place. If you had land, influence, or even a few chickens to your name, you were exempt. But if you stole a loaf of bread, couldn't pay your taxes, or just happened to catch an official's eye on draft day, congratulations. Someone somewhere was about to slap iron shackles on your wrists and march you hundreds of miles north to the edge of civilization. And that edge wasn't a fun one. You weren't asked to build a nice garden wall around the local temple. It was usually a remote mountain pass, a windswept desert, or a frozen frontier where the weather was as hostile as the nomadic raiders on the other side. The work soul-crushing, the conditions horrifying, but by the time someone became a wall builder, they had nothing left to lose. No choice, no future, and definitely no safety regulations. Plus, let's not forget the absolute lack of job perks. No days off, no glory, no comfortable retirement. You couldn't exactly quit and put helped build impenetrable fortress on your resume. You just had to stay alive, keep lifting, and never ever complain too loudly about the overseer, especially not when he was within earshot with his whip ready. Oh yeah, I'm just mixing mortar. The blood, just a minor wound, sir. So yes, nobody dreamed of being a Great Wall worker. They landed there because the empire needed bodies, lots of them, and yours was expendable, replaceable, and unlikely to be missed back home. You weren't the hero, you weren't even a footnote, you were just another back to break under the weight of imperial ambition. Let's burst the first myth wide open. Great Wall workers didn't receive specialized training with patient master craftsmen teaching the delicate art of stone fitting. There was no apprenticeship, no careful instruction, no pep talk. If you learned anything, it was by watching the guy next to you before he collapsed from exhaustion or disease. Most workers weren't skilled labourers. They were farmers, thieves or debtors who'd never touched a mason's tool in their lives. If you had some experience building village walls, great. That meant you might become a low-level supervisor instead of just another pair of hands. If not, well, moving stones is fairly intuitive, but doing it efficiently without crushing your own feet or causing a collapse that kills your entire work crew, that takes skill or luck, usually just luck. There were no manuals, no safety briefings, no proper orientations. You didn't get taught how to identify stable rock formations or how to mix mortar that wouldn't crumble in the first winter freeze. You figured it out while hanging from a mountain ledge, wondering if the harness made of twisted hemp would hold your weight for another hour. Mortar mixing? That was trial and error with heavy emphasis on error. Sometimes it held, sometimes your section collapsed in the first rainstorm, and you'd be the one rebuilding it under threat of punishment. There was no imperial quality control board to file complaints with, just overseers, quotas, and the constant threat of the whip. Sure, if you were lucky, and I mean lottery lucky, you might have picked up some skills from the rare trained craftsman or engineer. Maybe an older worker showed you how to split stones with fewer strikes, or carry loads without destroying your back. But mentoring wasn't standard. It was rare and short-lived because workers don't retire. They disappear into unmarked graves along the wall's path. Engineering training, forget it. You weren't consulted on design or structural integrity. You had your assignment, haul stones, mix mortar, stack bricks, and the only measurement that mattered was whether your section would stay standing long enough for the supervisor to move on to inspect someone else's work. So, no, you weren't some master stonemason creating an architectural wonder. You were a broken body with calloused hands, bent back, and a deeply unhealthy relationship with rocks. Success didn't come from training, it came from survival. You learnt how to build by doing it quickly, sloppily, then praying the next section wouldn't be yours when something collapsed. In short, your education was brutal, practical, and offered zero graduation ceremonies, just blisters, crushed fingers, and the creeping realization that you were very much expendable. Let's talk about why you became a great wall worker in the first place. Freedom, distant, unlikely, but theoretically possible freedom. The promise of it is what kept you going, but the reality, you got paid in false hope. When the Empire drafted workers, they offered terms. 3 years of service for criminals, 1 year for peasant conscripts, maybe less if you were exceptionally productive. That's if they were feeling generous. But here's the thing, 1 year of service was code for until your body gives out, or we decide you've served enough, or we simply forget you exist. So you did the work. You hauled stones up impossible slopes, mixed mortar with your bare hands in freezing weather, slept in caves or crude shelters. Not pretty, not dignified. And when your term was supposedly up, yes, about that release, the Empire suddenly needed you for just a few more months. The northern border was still vulnerable. The nomads were still a threat. Your experience was too valuable to lose. And even when you did get released, it was never quite the freedom you expected. Not after the injuries, the malnutrition, the lung disease from stone dust. You got a certificate of completion, a meager payment that barely covered your journey home, and a body so broken you might never work a proper job again. You'd spend 3 years breathing rock dust, sleeping on frozen ground, eating gruel so thin you could see through it, and in return you got permission to go home to a family that might have already given you up for dead. Congratulations. Even when the deal was real, you couldn't exactly go to court and file a complaint about your treatment. Your Excellency, I'd like to sue the Emperor for breach of labor contract. The only court you'd see was the one where you were being sentenced to another year for insubordination. So you learned to keep your head down, do the work, and trust absolutely no one. Not even the clerk who promised your family would receive stipends while you were away. They didn't, by the way. That money disappeared faster than morning mist in the Gobi Desert. Being a wall worker meant living on broken promises and vanishing before they broke you completely. So you've been conscripted. You've been lied to about the terms. You're probably going to die. Now let's talk gear. Forget the fancy illustrations in history books showing workers with proper tools and protective equipment. There were no steel-tipped chisels for everyone, no pulley systems at every work site, no specialized carts or proper scaffolding. Your toolkit consisted of whatever the Empire could mass-produce cheaply, or whatever previous workers hadn't managed to break beyond repair. If you were lucky, and I mean found an extra bowl of rice lucky, you had a decent iron chisel. Not sharp, not balanced, just functional enough to crack stone if you hit it hard enough for long enough. Hammers? Often just rocks with enough flat surface to strike a chisel. Shovels were wooden with maybe an iron rim if you were at an important section. Wheelbarrows existed but were in short supply. Why give you wheels when your shoulders worked just fine for hauling? Safety equipment? Laughable. Rope harnesses were made from whatever fibers were available. Hemp, twisted grass, occasionally leather straps recycled from military gear. They frayed, they rotted in the rain, they snapped under sudden weight. The only protective gear most workers had were the calluses on their hands and maybe cloth wraps for winter if the quartermaster hadn't stolen the supply. And you didn't get backups. If your chisel shattered, you might wait weeks for a replacement. In the meantime, use a rock, use your hands, just keep building or face punishment. You carried your tools in rough sacks, inside tunic pockets, or tucked into waistbands. You guarded them with your life, because losing a tool wasn't just inconvenient, it could be fatal to your already slim chances of survival. There were no upgrades, no specialized tools for different terrains. You didn't polish your chisel between jobs. You prayed it didn't break mid-strike and send shards into your eye. Because in this line of work, blindness was just another word for death. So no, the Great Wall wasn't built with architectural precision tools and safety equipment. It was built with crude implements, bleeding hands, and the constant improvisation of desperate people making do with almost nothing on the edge of civilization. In the end, it wasn't the quality of the tools that built the wall, it was the quantity of expendable workers who could be replaced faster than iron could be forged into proper equipment. Great Wall workers weren't sent to build in pleasant valleys with mild weather and convenient access to supplies. Your work site was deliberately where China needed protection most, the harshest, most remote, most dangerous borders imaginable, and those places, they were very hard to survive, let alone build in. First, there was the terrain. Not flat, comfortable plains, but sheer mountain ridges, rocky passes, and barren highlands. The wall didn't follow convenient paths. It intentionally claimed the highest, most inaccessible routes, because that's where defense made sense. You'd spend days just clearing a work site, hauling building materials up slopes so steep that modern hikers with proper gear find them challenging. Second, there was the weather. Northern China's climate is brutal. Winters that plunged to freezing with howling winds that cut through whatever rags you called clothing. Summers baking under relentless sun with no shade except what you could create with your own shadow. Spring brought floods that washed away work sites and autumn early frosts that killed the unprepared. You weren't building in the rain, you were building in the rain, in the snow, in sandstorms. The elements weren't just an inconvenience, they were actively trying to kill you daily. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, heat stroke dropped workers who couldn't find enough water, lightning struck the highest sections of wall, sometimes with workers still on them. Third, there were the locals, or rather, the lack thereof. No nearby villages to trade with, no local markets, no friendly faces. You were building in borderlands, where Chinese farmers feared to settle, and nomadic tribes occasionally raided. Some work sites were so remote that supply caravans arrived only monthly, if they weren't ambushed first. And finally, your actual target. The wall itself required impossible feats of labor, quarrying stone from mountainsides, mixing mortar in freezing conditions, lifting massive blocks without proper equipment. Some sections required hauling materials up slopes so steep that for every 10 workers who started carrying a load, only 7 might reach the top with it. Even getting to your assigned section could take weeks of travel through hostile territory. Workers died on the journey before laying a single stone. Others arrived so weakened they became sick within days. In short, you weren't just fighting to build, you were fighting to exist in places where nature itself seemed to reject human presence. The wall didn't conquer the landscape, it merely clung to it, built by people who had no choice but to cling alongside it until they couldn't hold on anymore. Let's be honest, when you picture Great Wall builders, you probably imagine industrious workers in simple but adequate quarters, eating basic but nourishing meals after a hard day's work. Reality, you slept in holes, sometimes literal holes dug into hillsides, caves if you were lucky, or crude shelters made of scavenged materials. There were no barracks for common workers, no permanent housing along most of the construction route. Disguises, you didn't need them. Your identity disappeared the moment you became a wall worker. You were no longer Zhang from Henan, or Liu the former soldier. You were just another body, indistinguishable from thousands of others, in ragged clothes and mud-caked skin. Your uniform was whatever you were wearing when conscripted, gradually falling apart and patched with whatever you could find. The goal wasn't to look respectable. The goal was not to freeze to death at night. Blankets were luxury items. Most workers slept huddled together for warmth, using their own bodies and whatever scraps of cloth they'd managed to accumulate. In winter, some dug into the earth itself, creating shallow pits that trapped slightly warmer air. And the food? Forget adequately feeding hard-working labourers. Your daily ration was a bowl of millet porridge, perhaps some pickled vegetables, if supplies were good, and occasionally dried fish or meat, if you were building an especially important section. More often, it was just grain, sometimes raw, if there wasn't fuel for cooking fires. Many workers supplemented by foraging, catching small animals, or trading with nomads, technically forbidden but necessary for survival. Water came from streams, often contaminated by the same workers who drank from them. Dysentery and other waterborne illnesses swept through work sites regularly. Clean water was sometimes more precious than food. Hygiene, non-existent. No baths, no latrines in remote areas, no concept of germ theory. The smell of a Great Wall work camp would have knocked you unconscious. Unwashed bodies, human waste, rotting food scraps, and the ever-present dust of stonework permeating everything. Medical care consisted of whatever folk remedies workers knew themselves. Serious injuries meant death. Minor injuries meant working through the pain until they became serious. Infections claimed as many lives as accidents. You lived in filth, worked in filth, and if you died, you were buried in the same filth, often in unmarked graves, or simply incorporated into the wall itself. The magnificent structure tourists walk today was built on a foundation of bones and suffering, by people who lived worse than the livestock in nearby farming villages. So no, you didn't have respectable quarters or dignified conditions. You had survival at its most basic, animal level, day after day, until the work killed you or released you. In medieval times, if you were an assassin, you didn't have a team. As a Great Wall worker, you technically had thousands of teammates, and it made you feel more alone than ever. You didn't have friends. You had competition for food, for better sleeping spots, for easier work assignments. There were no guilds, no worker organizations, no collective bargaining. Any attempt to organize workers was treated as rebellion and punished severely. The empire deliberately mixed workers from different regions who couldn't even understand each other's dialects, preventing the kind of solidarity that might have improved conditions. Why the isolation? Because in mass labor projects, unity meant trouble. Every shared complaint was a potential uprising, every friendship a possible escape plan. So supervisors watched for connections, separated relatives, and rotated workers between sections to prevent lasting bonds. Companionship. Laughable. After 14 hours of backbreaking labor, you had no energy for socializing. Lovers couldn't survive here. Romance required privacy, energy, and hope, 3 things in critically short supply on the wall. Family was a distant memory, a pain you tried not to dwell on, as months stretched into years with no word from home. Even fellow criminals kept their distance. In a world of limited resources, friendship was a luxury that could get you killed. Share your food too often, you'd starve. Trust the wrong person with escape plans. You'd be reported for an extra ration. No one wanted to grow attached to workers who might be dead within weeks. And don't expect sympathy. You couldn't tell anyone how much it hurt to haul stones until your shoulders bled. If you talked about your pain, people assumed you were weak, and weakness was targeted. Overseers singled out complainers for the worst jobs. Fellow workers avoided the unlucky and the ill like plagues, which often they were. So, you kept your thoughts, your pain, and your diminishing hopes to yourself. At meal times, you sat hunched over your bowl, back to the wall, eyes always watching for someone eyeing your portion. You never slept deeply. You didn't say your real name, unless forced, and even then, it probably wasn't your real one. Being a Great Wall worker meant perfecting the art of disappearing, not just from your former life, but from any meaningful human connection. In a crowd of thousands, you were utterly alone, just another replaceable body, moving stones, until you became one with them. Let's say you took a risk. You thought maybe, just maybe, you could escape this hellish construction site. You planned your route. You saved tiny portions of food for days. You memorized the guard rotations, and then you froze. Maybe a patrol appeared unexpectedly. Maybe the mountain pass was blocked by early snow. Maybe your own body betrayed you with weakness at the crucial moment. Guess what? You're now dead. Because failure for a Great Wall worker wasn't a reprimand or extra duty. It was execution, torture, or at minimum, a beating so severe you'd wish for death. Attempting escape was the ultimate crime. If caught, you'd likely face public punishment, not just to end your life, but to make an example for everyone else. Methods varied by dynasty and commander, but they shared one quality: theatrical cruelty. Workers would be forced to watch as you were beaten, branded, mutilated, or killed in ways designed to maximize terror. During the Qin dynasty, the harshest era of wall building, failed escapees might be buried alive in the wall itself, a horrifying end that doubled as a practical use of your body as building material. Under later dynasties, you might merely lose an ear, a hand, or be tattooed as a flight risk before being returned to even harder labor. And those were just the official punishments. Unofficial consequences could be worse. Overseers, angry that your escape attempt might reflect badly on their management, would assign you impossible tasks, ensure you received less food, or position you in the most dangerous work areas, places where accidents happened frequently. Even planning an escape could be fatal. There were always informants among the workers, desperate men who traded information for extra food or better conditions. One overheard whisper about freedom, and suddenly you're being dragged before the commander. Failure also meant shame, not the silent personal kind, the public, humiliating kind that marked you. Other workers would avoid you, partly from fear of association, partly from resentment that your failed attempt might bring harsher conditions for everyone. It didn't matter how many weeks you'd worked faithfully before. It didn't matter that conditions were inhumane. One mistake, one desperate bid for freedom, and you became a cautionary tale told in whispers around night fires. So you kept working. You kept lifting stones even when your muscles screamed. You kept moving, even when illness burned through your body. Because in this world, failure wasn't an option. It was a death sentence. So you did it. You survived. Against all odds. Through winters that froze men solid in their sleep. Through summers where heat stroke dropped workers like flies. Through disease, starvation, and back-breaking labor. You actually completed your term. Your section of wall stands firm. You've been issued your release papers. Congratulations. Now hobble back to a life that doesn't exist anymore. Because being a successful Great Wall survivor didn't mean riding triumphantly into your home village. It meant limping hundreds of miles with permanent injuries, lungs scarred from stone dust, and a body aged decades beyond its years. There was no victory parade, no pension, no official recognition, just a paper stamp and perhaps a few copper coins for the journey home. The moment your service ended, you became the Empire's problem no longer. No transportation provided, no food for the journey. Just point yourself south and start walking, often through the same hostile terrain where you'd been building for years. Guards didn't escort you to safety. You were on your own the moment you passed the last watchtower. Bandits targeted former wall workers specifically. They knew you'd be carrying your final payment and release papers, both valuable items on the black market. And let's talk about that home you're returning to. 3 to 10 years have passed. Did your family wait? Did they survive without your labor? Many returned to find their lands seized for unpaid taxes, their homes occupied by others, their spouses remarried after presuming them dead, children who didn't recognize them, parents already buried. Your skills, hauling stone and mixing mortar, had limited applications in farming communities. Your strength was gone, replaced by chronic pain and injuries that would never fully heal. Many former wall workers ended up as beggars, unable to work fields with damaged bodies, unwelcome burdens on families struggling to survive. Some discovered that release wasn't freedom at all. Village magistrates, always needing labor for local projects, would simply reassign experienced builders to new construction. Your expertise became a curse, marking you for more of the same work that nearly killed you. Those who did make it home often brought nightmares, violent outbursts, or strange illnesses contracted in the north. They were changed men, harder, quieter, haunted by memories of what they'd endured and what they'd seen others endure. So yes, you survived the wall. Now run from the life that waited after it, a life of pain, poverty, and the shattering realization that the world continued perfectly well without you. If being a Great Wall worker wasn't already miserable enough, poor, starving, and sleeping in caves that smelled like 1,000 men's misery, you also had to deal with the superstitions and fears that followed the wall like shadows. Because in ancient China, you weren't just building a defensive barrier, you were constructing something unnatural, something that carved across sacred mountains, diverted spirit paths, and disturbed the very feng shui of the empire. That kind of work attracted attention, not just from supervisors, but from the spirit world. Some believed the wall itself was hungry, that it demanded sacrifices to stand strong. Stories spread of workers deliberately entombed in the structure, their spirits bound to guard specific sections. Whether these were just tales to explain the many deaths, or actual practices depends on which historian you ask. But the fear was real enough to make men glance nervously at fresh masonry. Every natural disaster, every structural collapse, every unusual death was attributed to angry spirits, disturbed dragons, whose veins, the natural ridges of mountains, had been severed by the wall's construction, or the vengeful ghosts of workers who had died on site. You'd think these fears might help you. After all, people afraid of spirits might treat workers better, right? Wrong. When supernatural fears took hold, workers became both potential victims and potential solutions. If a section kept collapsing, someone might whisper that it needed a sacrifice. Suddenly, that sick worker who couldn't keep up might disappear overnight, his absence noted but never questioned. Carrying protection against evil, small jade pieces, written prayers, or tokens from home could mark you as superstitious, weak-minded, or worse, someone dabbling in folk religion instead of proper imperial beliefs. But not carrying protection left you vulnerable in the eyes of fellow workers. It was a no-win situation. Even the weather was imbued with supernatural meaning. Storms weren't just natural events, but signs of heaven's displeasure with the construction. Unusual fogs were wandering ghosts. Strange sounds in the night were the wails of workers who had died uncremated, their spirits lost far from ancestral lands. And heaven help you if you were working during a solar eclipse, a comet sighting, or any celestial event. Construction might halt while diviners were consulted, but workers wouldn't be resting. They'd be performing rituals, prayers, or sacrifices to appease whatever forces had been disturbed. In a world where education was limited and scientific understanding non-existent, these weren't just stories told around fires. They were the framework through which people understood their suffering, and sometimes, that framework demanded more suffering as its solution. The wall wasn't just breaking your body. In many workers' minds, it was corrupting your spirit, marking you as someone who had disturbed the natural order. Even if you survived to return home, some might keep their distance, unsure what invisible forces you'd brought back with you from that boundary between worlds. Poison. the assassin's weapon of elegance. For Great Wall workers, poisons were just one entry on an endless list of things slowly killing you, with special emphasis on slowly and painful. First off, literal poisons were everywhere. The northern borderlands contained plants unknown in central China, beautiful flowers and berries that looked edible but could cause paralysis, hallucinations, or agonizing death. Starving workers, supplementing meager rations by foraging, regularly gambled with unknown plants. You didn't have access to imperial botanical knowledge. You had your growling stomach and desperation. But the real poisons were more insidious. Stone dust, fine particles created by quarrying, cutting and carving, filled your lungs with every breath. Modern medicine calls it silicosis. Ancient workers called it stone lung, or quarryman's disease. It started with a persistent cough. Then came shortness of breath, weakness, and eventually suffocation as your lungs hardened from within. There was no treatment, no masks, no understanding of the danger until it was too late. Lead and mineral poisoning came from handling raw materials or working near smelting operations for metal components. Symptoms included confusion, weakness, stomach pain, and eventually organ failure. Workers exhibiting these symptoms were simply considered weak or lazy until they collapsed. The water itself could kill you. Work camps often contaminated their own water sources through improper waste disposal. Dysentery, typhoid, and parasitic infections spread rapidly through work sites. What began as stomach cramps could end with dehydration so severe that men died with their eyes sunken into their skulls. Even the food was suspect. Grain stored improperly grew mold containing deadly mycotoxins. Meat, when available, was often on the edge of spoilage. Food poisoning swept through camps regularly, with workers forced to continue laboring while violently ill. The Empire didn't track these deaths as poisonings. They were simply the background rate of loss expected in any large project. A commander who lost 30% of his workforce to disease wasn't failing. He was managing about average. And unlike assassination targets, war workers couldn't summon physicians, couldn't demand food testers, couldn't retreat to clean palaces when illness struck. You worked until you dropped, and if you survived, you worked again the next day. In the end, it wasn't dramatic executions or nomadic raids that claimed most war workers. It was these slow, invisible poisons, the dust, the water, the food, the minerals, that filled graves along the wall's path. Not with a scream, but with a wheeze, a cough, and finally silence. You'd think that if you successfully helped build the greatest defensive structure in human history, someone would remember your name. That your contribution to an engineering marvel, stretching thousands of miles, would earn you a footnote in the imperial records. Nope, you were a wall worker. That meant your name was never meant to be remembered. At best, you were a tally mark on a labor record, some character in a ledger, indicating one male, suitable for heavy work, 3-year sentence. Your individual effort, your suffering, your technical solutions to difficult construction problems, all of it vanished into the collective achievement. In fact, that was the point. The Great Wall wasn't built to celebrate individual workers. It was built to demonstrate imperial power, to show that the emperor could command such vast resources that hundreds of thousands of men could be sent to remote regions to move mountains, stone by stone. So, your name was buried the moment you arrived at the worksite. If you even used your real one, which many didn't. Criminals and debtors often gave false names, hoping to someday return to villages without the stigma of their punishment following them. And forget about honor. There were no medals for silent sacrifice. No stone monuments for the man who figured out how to anchor the wall to a particularly difficult cliff face. If a noble wanted recognition, they commissioned a plaque with their own name as the overseer or financier. You got a communal grave, an unmarked mound, or if things went really badly, your bones became part of the wall's fill. Sometimes your name was known only so it could be crossed off a list. Worker #347, died of fever. Replace immediately. That was your legacy. Not fame, not even infamy. Just absence. The wall itself became your only monument, anonymous, collective, and impossible to attribute to any single pair of hands. And if you were one of the estimated millions who died building it across various dynasties, not even your family might know exactly where your remains rested. So no, you didn't leave a mark as an individual. The marks were left on you, in broken bones, scarred lungs, and a body aged beyond recognition. While the wall would stand for millennia, you were expected to complete your service and vanish, as forgettable as the individual grains of sand in its mortar. So you survived. You completed your service. You even managed to avoid major injury or crippling illness. A miracle in itself. Now all you have to do is trust that your supervisors will honor your release date, provide your promised payment, and let you return home with dignity. Right? Wrong. Because in the world of Great Wall construction, there was one rule even more sacred than build or be punished: never trust anyone, especially the person controlling your food, water, and freedom. Your supervisor, be they a minor military officer, a convicted official serving their own sentence through management rather than labor, or a career construction overseer, didn't hire you out of respect. They were assigned you because they needed bodies, and you were the closest available body. Once your term was technically complete, you became a problem. Experienced, yes, but also entitled to release, payment, and replacement. So, what did they do? They lost your documentation. They claimed your sentence was actually longer than recorded. They discovered suddenly that you had committed some infraction that extended your service. They simply ignored your requests until you either accepted your fate or died trying to assert your rights. Even if your supervisor was uncommonly honest, the regional commanders above them might not be. Facing pressure to complete sections quickly or replace deceased workers, higher officials would simply refuse to process release papers during critical construction phases. Temporary extensions could stretch into years. There were even cases where workers who had served their full terms were reclassified as new offenders based on trumped-up charges of theft, insubordination, or attempted escape. No trial, no evidence, just a new sentence handed down because your experienced hands were too valuable to lose. And if you dared to organize resistance, demand proper treatment, or rally fellow workers whose terms had also been illegally extended, that wasn't demanding justice. That was rebellion against imperial authority, a capital offense. The punishment wasn't just execution, but the extension of your sentence to your male relatives back home. Your resistance wouldn't just kill you, it would condemn your sons and brothers to take your place. You might get paid and released if a new emperor declared a general amnesty, if your section was completed ahead of schedule, or if changing borders made your area less strategically important. But even then, you'd still have to trek hundreds of miles home, often through bandit-infested territories, carrying your payment in plain view. You were the secret that couldn't talk, the investment that couldn't be wasted. Even success wasn't enough to earn trust or release. Because in their eyes, if you built well once, you could build again. And no one, not even the empire that drafted you, wanted to start over with untrained replacements when experienced workers were already on site. Let's say somehow you beat the odds. You survived the labor, the climate, the disease, the malnutrition, the accidents, the poisoning, and the corruption. You outlived your sentence, your supervisor's attempts to extend it, and the treacherous journey home. Now what? You retire to a peaceful village life, tending modest fields and telling tales of the Great Northern Barrier. Absolutely not. Because in Imperial China, Great Wall workers didn't get retirement plans. There were no disability payments, no veterans benefits, no medical care for your ruined body. You didn't fade into a peaceful life. You vanished into poverty, or died trying to work fields with hands permanently deformed from holding stone tools. The problem was simple. You were never safe. Even if you walked away from the wall, your body didn't. You carried the wall in your lungs as stone dust, in your joints as premature arthritis, in your skin as scars and poorly healed wounds. The average wall worker aged decades in just a few years of service. Men in their 20s returned home with the bodies of elders, bent, brittle, and broken, and even if no one came after you. Another big if, as local officials often reconscripted experienced builders for local projects. You had to live with the constant pain of injuries that never received proper treatment. That shoulder you dislocated hauling stones, it never healed right. The fingers crushed under a falling rock, permanently curled into a claw. The frozen feet from winter construction, missing toes that made balance difficult. So you changed your name, perhaps. You moved to a village where no one knew your past. You claimed an old war injury, instead of admitting to wall service. But even then you didn't sleep well. The nightmares came, collapsing scaffolds, falling comrades, the endless hauling. Some workers reported hearing the sounds of construction in their sleep for years after release. The chip of hammers, the creak of ropes, the screams when something went wrong. And you couldn't trust your future either. Many wall workers died within 5 years of returning home. Their bodies simply gave out after the accumulated trauma. Others found they couldn't father children due to malnutrition and exposure to cold damaging their reproductive systems. Your legacy, your family line, might end with you. You lived like a ghost pretending to be a man. Too damaged to work effectively, too experienced with suffering to connect with normal village concerns, too haunted by what you'd seen to sleep peacefully. The truth was there was no endgame for a Great Wall worker, just a slow, painful fade into obscurity, always hurting, always remembering, until one day you slipped into the earth and no one remembered exactly what had broken you so completely. By now you've probably figured it out. Being a Great Wall worker wasn't a patriotic honor. It wasn't noble. It wasn't even all that historically significant on an individual level. It was a grim, thankless, short-lived sentence wrapped in imperial necessity and followed by a lifetime of physical agony. You wouldn't last, not a week, maybe not even a day, because you'd start with the wrong assumptions, that you'd be fed adequately, housed basically, treated as a human being, with minimal rights, but what you'd really be is cold, hungry, and one minor infraction away from a beating, or worse. You'd arrive at the construction site, limbs still aching from the forced march north, ready to do your part, only to discover that your sleeping space is a hole in the ground, your food is a watery gruel that wouldn't sustain a child, and the daily quota of stones is set by someone who's never lifted one. You'd freeze at the wrong time, drop the wrong load, question an order when you should have simply obeyed, and suddenly you're not a worker, you're a problem. Then what? You run, but you're not used to the terrain, the mountains, the forests, the searing deserts and freezing plateaus. You slip, fall, get caught by patrol riders who know the landscape intimately and have been catching escapees for years. And let's say you survive that. Then you deal with the aftermath. No medical care, no rest days, and no future. Just the growing realization that even if you complete your sentence, the best you can hope for is to die in your own village instead of a remote construction site, still in pain, still remembering what broke you. So no, you wouldn't last. And frankly, you shouldn't try, because the wall worker's life wasn't heroic. It was a cruel machine that consumed people by the millions, and produced a structure that would ultimately fail at its primary purpose anyway. It offered survival without dignity, and purpose without meaning. You didn't make history, you became mortar for it, and the only thing waiting for you at the end was silence. A silence no one would question, because no one even remembered you were a person in the first place. Before it was the awe-inspiring wonder of the world, before it became China's most recognizable symbol, the Great Wall was known simply as the Long Wall, or the Border Wall, a practical, brutal response to northern threats that consumed lives like kindling.